Hello and welcome to the program. I am Adeshawa Odushoga. The International Monetary Fund had previously warned Nigeria to check rising levels of debt, given its option to either diversify their revenue bases or face debt crisis. As of June 30, 2018, Nigeria debt profile stood at 22.3 trillion naira. The IMF advised the country to guard against the temptation to let higher oil prices delay reforms, warning that despite recent recovery, oil prices are projected to remain below the 2013 peak. However, in response to this claim, the Director General of the Nigeria's Debt Management Office, Patience Onia, says the country is not in any debt crisis, although she admitted that the nation was not generating enough revenue to fund some critical operations, but she maintained that Nigeria was still capable of serving her debts. She agrees that the country needs to generate more revenues, which she said, when compared to the country's gross domestic product, is rather low. Just recently, the Senate and the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority, NSIA, gave a warning to the federal government against returning the country into a debt trap. The Senate, who had approved President Buhari's request for $2.7 billion Eurobond, reiterated the concerns of the Bretton Woods institutions over rising public debt in Nigeria. The NSIA also warned that it is suicidal for the nation, the state, and some businesses in the country to borrow dollar-denominated funds from the international financial markets to finance infrastructure development in the country. Now, the big question is, could Nigeria really be facing a debt crisis? Gabriel Idahosa has been giving answers in this interview. Talking about the Nigeria debt crisis, the IMF warns that Nigeria is likely to go into debt crisis if we keep borrowing. But the Debt Management Office is saying that there's nothing as such is going into debt crisis, that all Nigeria needs to do is to generate more revenues. So what's your take on this?
Well, the IMF itself is not saying that Nigeria is in a crisis. I think the IMF carefully crafted their own statement that it is likely to go into a crisis if certain things happen. In other words, if the current trend continues for a long period, in other words, if our borrowing continues to rise at the rate at which it's rising, in the opinion of the IMF, there could be crisis. But the Debt Management Office is correct that there is no crisis at this point, and there are certain parameters that are used to really indicate whether there is a debt crisis. One of them is the debt to GDP ratio of a country. At this point, Nigeria is at 21%, and generally, when a country is below 40% of debts to GDP, you are considered safe in the sense that your debt level can be accommodated within that size of your GDP. So to that extent, Nigeria has not overborrowed. You could technically say Nigeria is underborrowed. But the other key parameter is your debt service ratio to your revenue. That is how much of your total revenue per annum you spend to service debts. That is where the IMF has a primary concern, and also the Nigerian business community is concerned that at this point, the federal government is spending about 70% of its revenue to service debts, which means that really it cannot service debts from its revenues. That's why it is borrowing to service some of those debts. So it is refinancing those debts. It's not a lot of the borrowing is not new debts, but it's just borrowing to pay old debts, because out of its current revenue, it cannot pay all the debts that are due. Because if you spend 70% of current revenue to service debts, it means that a lot of other areas will suffer.
So for a country like Nigeria, who is one of the largest oil producers across the world, why is there a need to borrow?
Whether you borrow or not is not a function of where you get your income from. Whether you get it from oil or from agriculture or manufacturing. Whether you borrow or not is your need to borrow. that's the driving force in borrowing. For a Nigeria that has a very large infrastructure deficit, we simply have to borrow. We have roads to build, we have bridges to build, we have hospitals to build, we have airports to build. A lot of our infrastructures are either dilapidated or not constructed yet, or operating suboptimally. Our railway system is either completely inoperational in many parts of the country, or they are in very bad shape. So we need to borrow. There's no there's no argument about that. The questions are really, how much do we need to borrow? And then, do we need to borrow to finance those infrastructures? A strong argument has been made that we don't need to borrow, for example, to build airports or build rail lines, because there are countries around the world who have many years' experience in building and operating airports and operating rail lines. They are willing to invest in Nigeria to build the airports, build the rail lines, build the seaports, and operate them the same way that companies have built our telephone systems and are operating them now efficiently with zero cost to government. Rather, these infrastructures, in the case of telecom, is now a huge source of revenue to government. And the argument of the business community and international agencies like IMF is that rather than borrowing to build these infrastructures, creates the enabling environment that will make local and international investors who have the financial and technical capacity to build and operate these infrastructures and generate revenue for government by way of licenses and other fees that government can collect. So that really is the argument. It's not whether we need to borrow or not, but do we need to borrow to provide this infrastructure? Are there alternatives? There are definitely alternatives. And I think a strong case can be made to say that government should stop borrowing and rather just create the necessary legislative and regulatory environment that will enable investors to invest in these key infrastructures.
So despite the controversy surrounding this debt crisis, the Senate has also warned that Nigeria is likely to go into debt crisis if we keep up with our borrowing culture. But they went ahead to approve the president's Eurobond. Why do you think, what's the reason behind this?
Because in any case, the Senate is part of the government, is the legislative arm of the government. So they are well informed that borrowing is absolutely necessary. We need to do that borrowing to refinance our debts. We need to borrow to pay old debts. That's really a lot of that borrowing is all about. So they are giving that warning with the same kind of thinking that IMF has. That look, we could get into crisis, so we need to watch our borrowing. And even the executive arm has listened to that concern. And so the government has reduced the budget for next year. They are scaling down the planned borrowing for next year because of these concerns. But it's not so much a matter of don't borrow, but rather attract those funds you are trying to borrow by way of investment under public-private partnerships. That is the way we need to be moving. Getting more and more partners, local and foreign, to bring in those revenues as investments into these infrastructures and services. And not only run them more efficiently, but more important, generate income to the same government by way of licensing and fees that whoever operates these infrastructures will have to pay to government.
So what is the implication of a country if, God forbid, we go into debt crisis? What is the implication of a country going into debt crisis?
Well, it's like any other debtor. If you get into crisis, then you are mortgaged to that country. The country can decide, the country or countries can decide to take over your infrastructures. They can decide to take your airport and run it themselves. They can decide to take the rail line and run it themselves. They essentially take over whatever they have financed. And the government does not have control anymore over those facilities. The thing with that kind of debt crisis is that the creditors cannot remove the infrastructure. They can't take away the rail line or the airport or the seaport. But they'll come here and run it. And you lose control as a government as to how they are run, You lose control over, for example, what they will charge. If they decide to run it and increase airport fees or seaport fees or rail charges, you will have no say because they now own it as creditors who have taken over. So it is the loss of sovereignty is the first thing. The second thing is that you also lose some control over your budget because they will force us to spend more and more of our budget on repayment of debts until those debts are settled. So that's the concern with debt crisis. And we have seen in some countries like Zambia, where they actually took over control of the police of the country. So you don't want a foreigner to start to run our police because we have a debt crisis. So those are some of the implications of a debt crisis. It's unlike an individual who can be locked up or taken to prison or whatever, or declared bankrupt. A country technically will not be declared bankrupt, but it can be virtually treated like a bankrupt because the creditor nations now run the country and the government has less and less control over its destiny. So that's really the fear that we could find ourselves in that situation, and no government or even the people, because the whole essence of being an independent country is that you run your own affairs. And you are no more a colony of any other country. So if you become heavily indebted, you're as good as a colony of your creditor countries or creditor industries. Even a multinational can control a country, as has happened in some debt-ridden countries, where a multinational that is a huge creditor to the country takes over control of most of the instruments of government until the debts are paid. And so those are the reasons why, as you can expect, on our side the Senate and on our side the IMF. The other issue with a debt crisis is that countries may be forced to go to IMF for bailouts. And IMF obviously don't have unlimited funds to bail out countries that are in debt crisis. So they want to ensure that before countries get to the point of running to IMF for bailouts, countries are aware of the likelihood of it happening and trying to find solutions. Because if all 180 countries in the world run to IMF for bailouts, clearly IMF doesn't have the capacity to deal with that. So they don't want that to happen too often. So those are the reasons why debt crises are a major concern to various stakeholders. The country, the business community themselves, that do not want their country to be controlled by outsiders, the international community that has limited capacity to bail out debt-ridden countries. And of course, it means that when you are debt-ridden, you do not have the capacity to grow the economy. You cannot invest in new infrastructure. You cannot improve your services, because that means that you have limited your capacity to borrow fresh funds. In fact, your capacity to borrow becomes almost zero if you are really debt-ridden. No country in the world wants to lend to a country in that situation. So your economy is stunted. It stops growing until the debt crisis is resolved and you begin to regain a good credit rating among all the rating agencies, and then you requalify to borrow. And that can take several years to resolve. And that's one reason why everybody is very, very cautious. So particularly for a country like Nigeria, because economic crisis in Nigeria rapidly becomes a regional crisis for West and Central Africa because of our population. And it then becomes a global crisis because an African crisis becomes a global crisis. So the world is very concerned about what's happening to Nigeria because we are so large that our problem is not really just an internal problem. It's a problem for all our neighbors and for the international community.
For the second time in a row, the Nigerian's inflation rate has risen again. According to the data made available by the Nigeria Bureau of Statistics, it says Consumer Price Index, which measures inflation, stood at 11.28% compared to 11.23% recorded in August on a year-on-year basis. This is the second consecutive month of inflation rise after 18 consecutive months of decline. The report reads that on the month-on-month basis, the headline index increased by 0.84% in September 2018, down by 0.21% points the rate recorded in August 2018. It also says the urban inflation rate increased by 11.70% year-on-year in September 2018 from 11.67% recorded in August 2018, while the rural inflation rate increased by 10.90% in September 2018 from 10.484% in August 2018. In the report, the MBS reveals that on a month-on-month basis, the urban index rose by 0.86% in September 2018, down by 0.14% from 1.00% recorded in August, while the rural index also rose by 0.82% in September 2018, down by 0.14% from the rate recorded in August 2018, which is 0.96%. It also shows that the composite food index rose by 13.31% in September 2018 compared to the 13.16% in August 2018. Some factors like the farmer herdsmen crisis and most recently flooding in some parts of the country have led to a drop in food production. Since the demand of food might surpass the supply, with this low food in production, Nigeria may be driving towards famine or even higher cost of food prices in the market. Not to forget that the World Bank has also cut its growth projection for Nigeria from 2.1% to 1.9% as a result of farmer herdsmen crisis. To discuss this, I had a chat with Gabriel Idahosa, the Vice President of the Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry. I'm still with the Vice President of the Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Gabriel Idahosa. Thank you for staying with us.
Thank you.
Looking at the food price inflation, for the second time in months and months, the food inflation is increasing. What do you think is the cause for this?
Well, two reasons. One remote, that is much longer, one immediate. The remote one has been the fact that we lost most of the Northeast in agriculture for several years, and that meant that our capacity to produce food at the level we were doing before the crisis really aggravated was reduced. That is the remote cause. The immediate cause, of course, is the massive flooding, which we had in several parts of the country. A lot of areas, several states lost several hectares of farmlands. In most cases, these were farmlands that were just ready for harvesting. Rice farms, a lot of rice farms were affected. Other vegetable farms across various states, all along the Niger and the river basin, were also severely affected. And not only were farms affected, the road infrastructure, a lot of bridges were destroyed. The road that took the farms, the jetties, the river ports that were used to move products were also affected. So both the food themselves and the logistics of moving the food to the urban areas were all affected. So that's what is reflecting in the food price inflation we are seeing, but which is a short term, because hopefully we don't have another flood next year, then we begin to recover lost grounds.
The food prices is increasing and the minimum wage remains constant. How do you think this would affect the livelihood of an average Nigerian worker?
The value of the money in their hands continues to go down because inflation is moving, the income is fixed. So it certainly means a deterioration in the quality of living of Nigerians. But the big issue is when it comes to minimum wage, somebody has to pay that wage. Whatever the wage, if it is what it is now, if it's a higher wage, somebody has to pay that wage. So the question is, does that somebody have the money to pay higher wages? Because after the negotiations, somebody has to pay those wages. And that's the difficulty you have. Because there are three parties involved in paying those wages. You have the federal government, you have the state governments, then you have the organized or the private sector. All three are supposed to pay those minimum wages. Well, all three are saying that they don't have the same capacity. Even among the states, Zamfara State does not have the same capacity as Lagos or Rivers State. And that is where the real difficulty is about talking about minimum wage. In other countries that are truly federal systems like Nigeria, you don't go to the federal capital to negotiate minimum wages. Rather, the NLC branch in Lagos will negotiate with the Lagos state government, agree a minimum wage for Lagos, because Lagos state government knows their capacity. The NLC branch in Zamfara will negotiate with Zamfara State and agree a minimum wage for Zamfara. At the end of the day, by the time you take the minimum wage agreed in each of the 36 states and the federal capital, the lowest of those wages now becomes officially the minimum wage in Nigeria, statistically. And that is what happens in a federal system like America, where every state negotiates their minimum wage. And at the end of the day, just for statistical purposes, you list all the minimum wages. And then for the World Bank or Nigerian Bureau of Statistics, they will publish the lowest as the minimum wage for Nigeria. But obviously for matters of their own internal structure, the NLC has not been able to come to that realization that that is the realistic way to go. Because so long as you go to Abuja and say that we want a minimum wage, which everybody can pay, which Zamfara can pay, Rivers can pay, Lagos can pay. Zamfara is telling you we can't pay, that even this 18,000, we can't pay now. So we don't even talk about increasing it. Lagos can pay much more, but we have to keep quiet and wait and see how the matter is resolved. So eventually we'll have to get to that situation where the Nigerian Labour Congress will accept that that is reality, which is to say, ask each set of payers, each state and federal, how much can you pay, negotiate and agree. In the case of the private sector, there's NECA, the Nigerian Employers Consultative Association, which is well positioned to negotiate with the NLC, the workers' union, on minimum wage for the private sector. Again, the NLC is reluctant to do that. They want a global agreement in Abuja where everybody signs into one document and it becomes a minimum wage. And that is the real reason why it's so difficult to resolve, because the whole basis of going into the negotiation is structurally not sustainable.
But some analysts are of the opinion that the increase in food importation is the reason behind food inflation prices. What's your view on this?
We import to the extent that we don't produce some of the products, but we have the capacity. So we import as a matter of default because we don't produce enough rice, for example. We import, and of course we import the inflation with it because of the naira dollar exchange rate. So the real cause of it is our inability to locally produce. Once we don't produce locally, it is now a default situation that we now import. So looking at import is not really looking at a solution. It's just recognizing a symptom of the problem. The problem is to produce far, in fact, in excess of our local needs so that we can export. We used to import cement. Now we are exporters of cement. So we need to get to the position where we produce so much rice that it doesn't make sense to even smuggle rice into the country. Like now, it would be silly for anybody to try to smuggle cement into Nigeria where we have so much cement around. So really the issue is not going to the borders and be fighting the smugglers. It's producing so much rice that you probably will have to eat your rice if you are a smuggler, because there's nobody to buy the rice from you. And that goes for wheat, that goes for tomatoes, that goes for a lot of the other products. So really our capacity, we have the land, we have the climate, we have the financial base to support the agricultural sector. So we have really no business worrying about importation if we use our own capacity to produce these products.
What do you think the government should do? What role do you think the government should play in trying to control this increase in food price inflation?
Well, essentially do a lot more in supporting the entire agricultural value chain, because one is land preparation. There are huge arable land in Nigeria not yet cultivated. So you want to start from there. You want to start with the inputs to the farmers. Government is already doing a lot for fertilizers now. You want to have equipment for preparing the farmlands. So government is doing a lot of tractor hiring services now. So most farmers do not need to have tractors. They can hire the tractors and prepare their land. Then you look at the quality of seeds that are used. Government also is doing a lot of that. They need to do a lot more to get farmers the seedlings at the best price at the right time. So that also has to happen. Then post-harvest issues, when the products are due for harvest, ensuring that as soon as they are harvested, they are moved to storage. So to reduce post-harvest losses, because most of the farmers, particularly of goods like vegetables, will tell you they lose, or tomatoes, they lose probably 40, 50, 60% of the harvest. So we need to have that. Then our capacity to process. If you take cashew, cocoa, even cassava gari, we need to process most of these products. And it is there, most of the value is in the processing. So if government is doing a lot in every stage of the agricultural value chain. It is just the size that is the issue. For example, if we have 36 states, we have thousands of farmers, and the current government support is only reaching maybe 2,000 farmers in Kebbi State, 1,000 in Plateau State, and you have hundreds of thousands of farmers who are not touched by all these government programs. Then you have a problem. So it's not a matter of concepts of what to do. It is the skill of doing it that is the primary issue. We have to expand the skill of all these government initiatives, whether it is lending, whether it's seedlings, whether it's hiring, tractor hiring. A farmer should not have to go more than 2 or 3 kilometers to find a tractor hiring service. But there are farmers now who probably have to go 10, 15, 20, 40 kilometers to reach the nearest tractor hiring service. So it is in all those areas in the value chain that you need to take action. Most farmers have land that have no C of O, so they cannot borrow. So you want to have a way to ensure that every farmer, wherever he or she is in this country, can easily get a C of O, go to the bank and raise money for whatever they want to do on the farm. So there are all these little things that are being done, but the scale of doing it, it's far, far below what you need to get the kind of results that we deserve as a country.
Well, that's it on the program of this edition of Money Matters. To watch us again, visit our YouTube channel at TV360 Nigeria, or follow us across all our social media platforms at TV360 Nigeria. Thank you very much for watching. I am Adeshewa Udushaga. Bye for now.